Hey everybody, it's Dr. Jensen with CCJ 3701 Research Methods in Criminology. So this is a kind of a brief lecture to show you how to build a figure. So these are these little bubbly charts that you see inside journal articles that kind of describe the different topics or variables that they're looking at and how they think they relate to each other. So it's really easy, but we do use a format to do this. Circles mean one thing, arrows mean another, boxes mean one thing. So it's pretty easy to learn. So I thought I would just do a quick overview so you can build yours. So here is figures. So basically a figure is going to illustrate to the reader the variables that you're using in your study. Which ones are the independent, dependent, and control variables. And if any variables are multidimensional, like a scale or an index, and they have lots of little variables inside one big variable. So we're going to be making scales and indices soon, so you'll get to see what this looks like in depth a little bit more. But let's start at the very beginning. So the independent variable, we always read graphics left to right. So you start with a circle on the left. Independent variable, or what we call the predictor variable, should be the very first circle that the reader sees, followed by an arrow indicating a proposed relationship and direction. So we kind of say this thing relates to this. You draw a circle and then you point an arrow coming out of it. So in this case, we're going to do an example of a research question. How does a person's religiosity impact their marital satisfaction and why? So we're going to start with our predictor variable, religiosity. We think by knowing your religiosity, we can predict your marital satisfaction. So we would start with our independent variable, religiosity, put that in the bubble. You're all set. And then you do your dependent variable. Again, this is your main relationship that you're interested in, the main topics you want to test. So your dependent variable circle objects is on the far right, indicating an outcome or what happens, the results of the influence of the independent variables. So given this, draw the arrow pointing to that. This is the result of that. So we label these objects together the focal relationship or the relationship of focus. This is the major one we're studying since we think it has the most direct influence. So this is your independent and dependent. So pretty easy so far, but we can make these really kind of funny looking and crazy if we want to. But basically that's a simple figure, is independent with an arrow pointing to the dependent. And then we just, put the little words inside the bubbles. Control variables are, again, just additional independent variables. Not the main focus of the study, but ones that we are interested in that we think also influence what happens. We represent those by smaller circles, indicating less importance, but some potential relevance to the outcome or the dependent variable. So we put those a little bit underneath and off to the side. So you still have this nice line that goes kind of from here to here, this linear relationship, right? Independent, dependent. And then you stick the little control variables kind of off to the side. Well, these are kind of sideshow, other relevant things that also point to that outcome. So you just put little bubbles, again, a little bit smaller off to the side. So we think that knowing a person's income and how many children they have may also influence how satisfied they are with their marriage. If you're going to build a scale, and some of you will do this, it's not required for class, but it depends on what you want to measure. A scale could be any number of things. So anytime you take multiple variables and you shove them together to all measure something bigger, that's building a scale. So a variable represented by a scale, it could be an independent variable, a dependent, or a control, or all the above. You could have scales all over the place. Have the items or the concepts within the scale hanging from below the variable name in a box. So it indicates that these are little pieces of or elements of things that contribute to this big concept. So these kind of hang off the larger circle. You do not use arrows. You just do lines, kind of like they're dangling off a mobile or something like that. So down here you see religiosity. Religiosity is kind of a tricky concept to measure. Observing someone's religiousness or how religious they are. So we used 4 variables to make a scale, and they're all hanging off in little boxes down below. So we have reading sacred texts, participating in rituals, feeling spiritual connections, and church attendance. So we felt like all of these together are different little elements of what someone's religiosity is. So we're going to kind of see how people answered all four of those questions and combine them all to contribute to this big idea of religiosity. So this is how you would illustrate it in a figure. They get boxes, so we know that's not the main variable, but this lets us show what's inside of it. That's all it is. That's a scale. Okay, so once you put it all together, you have this, right? So the reader can use this figure to understand the relationships and variables all at once. So they can kind of say, okay, here's the independent, here's the dependent. These are going to be other variables that matter. These are some things inside the independent. But this can take on a lot of different forms. It uses the same notation, but it can look differently. It's very useful to illustrate this in the middle of your paper while describing your theory and methods, because it represents your proposed explanations, your proposed measures, and it allows the reader to keep track of everything in one place. So often when I would read student papers or journal articles, I would find myself drawing these out and saying, okay, here's this is related to this goes this direction. And it's just more convenient if you have a little graphic that shows all of your topics and variables at once, so that way they can see it all together in one place. So here's some other examples of how crazy these little things can get. I'm going to move myself up here. So you see kind of up at the top, we have parent-child relationship. This is an independent variable. It actually has a scale inside of it because it's kind of hard to measure exactly how to observe a parent-child relationship. So they had some variables they used. Are you close to mom? Are you close to dad? Do you trust your parents? Do you enjoy spending time together? And those four things they felt like would contribute to an overall measure or observation of what a parent-child relationship is. So this tells me there's a little scale going on with the independent variable. Here's that big arrow pointing to delinquency. Okay. Now delinquency is another concept that is kind of tough to measure by itself. So sometimes we have survey questions or items or fields in a data set that we say, okay, well, we have all these individual crimes or behaviors. If we put them all together, we could call that delinquency. So in this case, they used theft, assault, cocaine use, running away. There are clearly many other ways to measure delinquency, but this is just an example. Okay, so we can see they actually have a scale on the independent, a scale on the dependent, and then the focal relationship, you see all these other little ones. Feeling depressed, feeling unpopular, your age, being in poverty, your dating habits, whether or not you're an athlete, they all think those have some kind of relationship also to delinquency in the form of control variables. So it can get really busy in here. It depends on how you want to diagram things. Over here, on another example below, experienced disability discrimination. Again, here's the control variables. This one shows how you have a control variable that has a scale on it. So you can hang these little boxes from anything, but you don't have to have a scale. Maybe a variable is good as is in the data set, and you don't need to add anything to it or change it. That's perfectly fine. For illicit drug use, they found 3 different survey questions on cocaine, meth, and heroin. And so they kind of put those all together to illustrate illicit drug use. Again, not having to do that. You could just actually take meth by itself or heroin by itself or cocaine by itself if you wanted to, but they just wanted to look at them all together. Depends on how you want to do it. There's lots of choices. So in this class, you're going to hear me say that's a researcher choice, meaning it's really up to the researcher as to what they have in mind, how they want to measure it, conceptualization, operationalization, stuff like that. And then you can see here the control variables. They got kind of moved around in these smaller little boxes. And on this side, you see the big dependent variable of unemployment. So again, it's just a little roadmap to show all the pieces. Pretty easy to make. It takes a little practice, so that's why I have an assignment in there to start to diagram some of the topics you'd like to do. That way you can get your diagram going. You can find these kinds of shapes and arrows in pretty much any program out there, like Word or Pages or PowerPoint or any Keynote. You'll find them everywhere, so they're pretty easy to make. And I also have a few that I dropped in the exercise if you want to copy and paste them and point them around and stuff. So hopefully you found this helpful on how to draw figures that illustrate variable relationships. And now when you see these kinds of shapes in the future, you can understand how they work and what's going on. All right, we'll see you next time.